Okay, we're going to pick up from part 3, and we were looking at poverty rates by different categories, demographic categories, to kind of get a feel for how poverty breaks down across the U.S. population. And the last thing that we're going to look at here was poverty by work status. And it kind of does launch us into the next kind of part of the discussion. And so I think it's apropos, actually, that this kind of was the very last slide. I should have planned it that way. I didn't, but it's a happy coincidence. So if we look at work status, and again, I'm going to show you this both between groups and within groups here, right? If we look at work status, on the left, you can see that those who worked full-time in the study period here had a 2.2% poverty rate. Right? But we would expect that, right? That people who are working full-time should not, many of them should not be poor. Those who worked less than full-time, we would typically just say that this is part-time work, right? So people who are working part-time have a 13.4% poverty rate. Notice that that is awfully close to the rate for the entire U.S. population. It's a little bit higher, but very close. And those who did not work at least 1 week, and the majority of these people did not work at all, have a poverty rate of about 31%. Okay, so that looks very much as you would expect. Now, if you look at the graph over on the right, okay, poverty by work status, and my pen's not working so well, so you'll notice that this is as a percentage of all poor Americans, right? As a percentage of all poor Americans. 10.9% of all Americans who are poor actually did work full-time. Almost 26% of Americans who are poor worked, but they worked less than full-time. So we would consider them underemployed. We'll talk about that in a second. So that means that almost a third of Americans, or pretty much right at a third of Americans who are poor, are actually working, right? And of course, we refer to these folks as the working poor. They're working. In some cases, they're working full-time, but they're not making enough money or enough income to be able to bring their income above the poverty line. And then the other 2/3 of poor Americans did not work for at least 1 week, and most of them did not work, right? So we are talking about a pretty stark statistic here, if you think about it, right? The idea that you could work, you could even work full-time and still not make enough money to bring yourself over that poverty threshold. So that gets us into, sorry, I just realized I hadn't made that big. That gets us into 3 categories of people who live in poverty in the United States. And if you look at all the statistics that we just covered, you could kind of devise these categories, particularly from the last slide. But people living in poverty in the United States typically fall into 3 categories, right? Those making only the minimum wage, or making insufficient wages. So that's the working poor that I just mentioned. Those who are unemployed or underemployed, and those with the inability to work, so they have some deficit in human capital that prevents them from working, either poor education or training, or disability, or some other issues, right? So let's look at these categories individually. The working poor, the Census Bureau categorizes them as those making only minimum wage. In some cases, that may not be exactly right. They might be making more than minimum wage, but they're not working enough to be able to bring that income over the poverty threshold. Formally, so the technical measurement of the working poor, we're talking about people who spent at least 27 weeks in the labor force. So they worked more than half the year, if you add up all the time, right? But whose family or personal incomes fall below the poverty line. The number of working poor in the United States has grown significantly in the last 30 years, right? This category of individuals has grown, and that is troubling because what it suggests is that the value of work has declined or decreased. Why is that? Again, if we were in class, this is what I would ask you to tell me. Why is this the case, right? There are several explanations. One, of course, is that there's been a change in the U.S. economy over the last 30 to 40 years. We have transitioned from an industrial economy to a service and technology economy. So we have replaced those industrial jobs, which were typically unionized and paid high wages and had good benefits for that reason. And we've replaced them with lower paying service jobs. Note that this also exacerbates income inequality because the jobs that do stay here in the United States that pay well are almost all white collar jobs that require higher education levels and higher levels of training. And so what's left for individuals who don't have that kind of training are typically lower wage jobs or what we would call lower quality jobs. Lower wage jobs also cost people more in the sense that they are less likely to provide good benefits. So not only are you making less money, but you're having to spend more of what you make on things like insurance on the private market or higher healthcare costs. And then, of course, anytime you have to take sick leave, you're losing money that way, right? And so there's kind of a double whammy here when we talk about lower wage jobs. That's one of the reasons that the number of working poor has grown in the last 30 years. I'm going to leave other reasons for a quiz question. So I'm going to stop there with those examples. The second category of the poor in America are the underemployed and the unemployed. We do have very technical definitions of unemployment, who counts as unemployed or employed in the United States. You're considered employed if you did any work for pay or profit during the time that the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the Department of Labor and the Census Department are measuring unemployment and employment. And they measure it at several different times per year in order to account for seasonal fluctuations, right? Some employment is seasonal. Tourism employment, for example, is seasonal. Think about people who work here in Myrtle Beach. Farm employment may be seasonal, all right? So they do measure it at different times in order to account for those seasonal fluctuations. This would include all part-time work, any temporary work, as well as full-time year-round employment, right? You're also counted as employed even if you weren't working during the measurement period, as long as you still had a job and you were just out of the office, for example, because you were on vacation or you were taking sick leave or maternity leave, or even if you were on strike, you're considered employed, you're just not working at that moment, okay? So this measurement means that you're also counted as employed even if you are part-time and looking for a full-time job, right? In that case, we would consider you to be underemployed. You're working at least part-time, but you really want a full-time job and you just cannot find one. So in that case, we would consider you to be employed, but we would say you are underemployed. Underemployment is really an interesting status in the United States that we don't pay enough attention to. The unemployed measurement, you are considered unemployed by the government if you don't have a job, but you have actively looked for work in the last 4 weeks and you are currently available for work. So if you were offered a job today, you could take it. You're considered unemployed in those cases, right? The category of unemployment you rarely hear about is not in the labor force. So these are individuals who have no job and they are not looking for one. That might be because they don't want or need a job, right? So think about women who have made the choice to stay at home with their children or just to stay at home as a homemaker. But also people who are going to school, people who are retired are not in the labor force. But so are people who have basically given up on looking for work, right? Discouraged workers is what we would call them. So those people are not considered unemployed. Remember, to be considered unemployed, you have to be looking for a job. These are folks who basically have said, I can't get a job, I don't have the right skills, I've not been successful thus far, so I'm basically going to give up, or I'm going to step back, or I'm going to go back to school and get some training, right? That's a positive spin on it, and those folks would just be considered not in the labor force. Note that none of these measures of unemployment or employment assess the adequacy of employment, right? So that goes back to that underemployed category. We're not in this measurement, in the federal government measurement of employment, we're not concerned with how good the job is or the adequacy of the income of that job. That's just not included as part of this measure. Okay. There are different types of unemployment, which I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, probably in the last part of this lecture, part 5. So I'll hold off on that, but it is important to understand the differences. The last group of individuals living in poverty are people who we say are unable to work, right? So these are people who, there's some barrier to work for them, right? There's something that's keeping them from entering the labor market. Sometimes it's a problem of their own making. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes it is, it has to do with illness, right? Or a deficit in human capital, right? So those who are unable to work, it could be that they can't work because they don't have the right education or training. So they can't find a job that utilizes their skills. It could be because they have some disability that actually prevents them from working. That could be a physical disability or an injury, right? That keeps them from doing certain types of work or any work at all. They could have a mental disability or an intellectual disability. Here we would also categorize folks who are unable to hold a job because of mental health, right? So they have a mental illness that prevents them from being able to hold down a job on a regular basis. Folks who can't hold down a job because of substance abuse problems, so they miss a lot of work or they underperform on the job, so they're not able to work on a regular basis. And those who are victims of domestic abuse, who, very similar to substance abuse, may miss a lot of work in order to hide that abuse or have other issues connected with that abuse and are unable to hold a job for that reason. Right, so all of these groups of folks who are poor, you can kind of see that we would make different policies or we would apply different social policy remedies for each of these categories because their situations are very different, right? What we might do for the working poor is very different, right? We might address that through policies about minimum wage. We might address that through policies having to do with fair labor practices. We might do something about wage growth from a macroeconomic standpoint versus, say, the unemployed, where we might use some kind of education or job training remedy. Or we may have to do some work on spatial mismatch, which we'll talk about in a second, versus the inability to work, right? Folks in that category have some other issues that have to be addressed so that they can basically earn enough income to rise above the poverty threshold, right? So it's important to understand kind of these 3 separate categories precisely because we're going to apply different remedies or different policy solutions to each of them to be successful. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution for every poor person in America, right? Really important to remember that. So we're going to talk about why the poor are poor. So why do people find themselves in these situations in the last part of this lecture, part 5. So hang on and you can load that one up.